Welcome to this event of the Chennai International Centre. We are privileged to have with us Ambassador Gokhale and Ambassador Tirumurthy, both distinguished colleagues whom I've had the privilege of serving with, and it is my proud privilege to introduce both of them. Mr. Vijay Gokhale has been with us on several occasions before, but it's a pleasure to have him again and again at the Chennai International Centre. Welcome, sir. He is a former Indian Foreign Service officer who joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1981. He served as High Commissioner to Malaysia from 2010 to 2013. He was Ambassador to Germany 2013 to 2016 and Ambassador to China 2016-17. Currently, he is a distinguished professor at Symbiosis International Pune and a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie, India. He is author of 4 books: Tiananmen Square, The Making of a Protest, HarperCollins in 2021; The Long Game, How China Negotiates with India, Penguin 2021; After Tiananmen, The Rise of China, HarperCollins in 2022; and Crosswinds, Nehru, Zhao, and the Anglo-American Competition over China, Penguin 2024. His research includes papers and articles on China in India in leading media publications, and he was awarded the Ramnath Goenka Award for Excellence in Journalism Non-Fiction Books in 2021 for The Long Game. Welcome, Ambassador. Let's give him a big hand. On this event today is a familiar figure, Tirumurthy, again a very dear friend and colleague. He has also served on very important assignments during his career. He was in the Foreign Service with a diplomatic career spanning 37 years between 85 and 2022. He served as ambassador, permanent representative of India to the United Nations in New York between 2020 and 2022. He was president of the UN Security Council for August 2021 and also chair of 3 committees of the council. Earlier, he was secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs. Ambassador Tirumurthy has previously served in Cairo, Geneva, Gaza, Washington, D.C., Jakarta, and was also India's High Commissioner to Malaysia. Please. Ambassador Tirumurthy has previously served in Cairo, Geneva, Gaza, Washington, D.C., Jakarta, and was also India's High Commissioner to Malaysia. He was India's first representative to the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. He served in various capacities in Ministry of External Affairs, New Delhi, including head of the United Nations Division and head of division of 4 neighboring countries, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Myanmar. He was also a climate change negotiator for several years. He is currently a distinguished professor in IIT Madras, and he is the author of 3 books. Please welcome Ambassador Tirumurthy and Ambassador Gokhale onto the stage.
Friends, I'm delighted to welcome Ambassador Vijay Gokhale. I thought that maybe he can give a sense of what's happening in the next 20 minutes, after which I thought I'll have an interaction with him, and then we will throw it open to questions from the floor. Vijay, you have the floor.
Thanks, Thiru. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for having me in Chennai. It's always a pleasure to come here and see all of you and to talk to all of you. We've just started the Pune International Centre, and we've just built the building. So hopefully Pune will in some time become a center of intellectual discourse the way that Chennai or Bangalore is, but we are a little behind at the moment. So coming here is always great fun for me. I just want to as a sort of stage setter, make a few remarks on the world as it appears to me today. And the real reason is I prefer a question and answer session or hearing views from members of the audience. So I think I'd prefer that mode rather than just simply talking at length. But I just want to share some thoughts on the subject of what the world looks like today. And I want to just begin by putting things in context, because I think we very often tend not to understand how important context is in understanding the world today. In 1990, when the Cold War ended, when the Berlin Wall fell, and when the Soviet Union collapsed, the West, led by the United States, believed that they had earned the right to shape a new international order for the 21st century. And from their perspective, that new world order would be built on two pillars. The first was Western style democracy, what they call liberal constitutional democracy in the West. And the second pillar was free market economics. Now, this was entirely understandable because democracy had arrived as the most viable political organizing principle of the 20th century. It had defeated four empires in the First World War. The Russian, German, Austro Hungarian, and Ottoman empires all collapsed. It decisively defeated right wing fascism, Nazi Germany, in the Second World War. And it humbled socialism, of which the Soviet Union was the symbol at the end of the Cold War. So the United States led West believed that it was the most durable political principle, and the rest of the world must therefore adopt it as a national standard as well. The other aspect was the economic side. And there, of course, the end of the Cold War meant that all the barriers that were set up after the Second World War fell. And therefore, the movement of goods, but more importantly, of capital and technology across the world became much, much easier. And of course, we saw the rise, therefore, of the whole concept of supply chain economics. You could make bits and pieces of a particular machine or a particular item in various countries, assemble it in a third or fourth or fifth country, and sell it to the developed markets at a price which was much cheaper than making it in the United States or in Europe. And what the West believed was that this new phenomenon, economics and technology in particular, would drive the world hereafter. And they could sequester economics and technology from geopolitics. In other words, there'd be little wars here and there, those would be managed. But by and large, the world would not be defined by geopolitics, but by economic progress and, of course, technological progress, which was what really drove the world after 1990. Unfortunately for them, the world has not panned out that way. And that is for a variety of reasons. You have 9/11, you have the global financial crisis, you have the COVID pandemic, but you also have the rise of China, you have the return of Russia to the international stage, you have emerging economies like ours, and you have the relative decline of the United States. I say relative decline because it's still the most powerful country in the world, but it is no longer so dominant that it can do whatever it wishes. And this has created a deep sense of frustration. So if I were sitting today in Berlin or in London or in Washington or in Paris, I think I'd be entitled to feel that the world is in complete chaos. And from this chaos, essentially, is born the phenomenon of Donald J. Trump. I think it's a mistake for us to believe that it is Donald Trump who is disrupting the world. He is only a symbol, he's not the cause of disruption. It is essentially a reflection of American anger that a world that they created in 1945, that they nurtured through 75 years, that they defended if they had to, has failed to pay back in terms of wealth or jobs or influence that the American public, rightly or wrongly, feels entitled to. And therefore, Donald J. Trump is taking apart the world that America built for the rest of us, bit by bit, piece by piece, and trying to rebuild it as MAGA, Make America Great Again, which effectively means that it is no longer going to be charitable, it's going to be transactional, and every country is going to be judged by what it can do for America. Doesn't matter if you're a friend or a foe, if you're near or far, if you're big or small, the touchstone is what can you do for us? And that is going to be the American policy going forward, even with allies and partners like us. And all of us are going to have to pay a price, a higher price than we've paid in the past, to adjust our relationship with the United States. There's, of course, the debate as to whether the US is going to be isolationist or not. I do not think that is possible, simply because the world's largest economy needs all of us to remain the world's largest economy. But it is certainly going to be less dependable. It is going to become less active in terms of policing the world, perhaps even in terms of financing the world. And therefore, for many countries, what you already see, right from their closest allies in Europe to countries which are more distant and less allied to them like us, but still partners, is hedging strategies. The trust that the implicit trust that the United States would be there for us, I think, is to a great degree, to a lesser or greater degree, disappearing from many foreign offices and many chancelleries across the world. And we have to see whether this will lead to the complete disintegration of the global order that the Americans have built. But I think what one can say today is that the fragmentation of that global order is actually picking up pace. And that's something that we as Indians should be paying particular attention to. On the other side of the world, you have another great power, the People's Republic of China. And that's not a rising power, it's a fully risen superpower. It's had a remarkable, some say miraculous run, 30 years of double digit growth. And just to put it in perspective, in 1990, just as I was completing my first tenure in Beijing, the GDP of the two countries was virtually identical. And per capita GDP of India was slightly higher than China's. 10 years later, when I completed my second term in Beijing in 2000, the GDP was already double India's. It was 1.2 trillion to our half a trillion, and the per capita income was also perhaps double India's. Today, China's GDP stands at $19 trillion. We are at 4 trillion plus minus 10%. So it shows you what a spectacular run this country has had. And today, you can't think of a world without China because practically everything that all of us are using or wearing or bits and pieces of it come from China. In terms of supply chain, in terms of shipping, in terms of semiconductors, China is a dominant player in the world. A leader who came to power in 2012, President Xi Jinping, therefore believed that China's opportunity had come. He is somebody who thinks long term. He's interested in history, often quotes history in his speeches. And he coined the word once in a century change. In his mind, every once in a century, an opportunity comes along which countries have to seize. And if they seize it, they rise. So 1815, the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte in Europe, Britain's rival of 800 years was decisively defeated and the British century began. 1918, the collapse of European empires, the rise of the American century. And Xi Jinping came just after the global financial crisis, when America was struggling with two wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, when terrorism was at its height. And I think Xi Jinping genuinely believed that this once in a century time had come for China. China had been the global engine of growth in the global financial crisis. And therefore, the sense was that China was going to rise. The United States led West would have to make place for it at the table. It would have to accommodate China's interests and concerns. And as for the rest of us, India included, well, we would just have to acquiesce or defer to their interests in the manner that we did with the United States and to the Soviet Union in the 60 years between the Second World War and the collapse of the Soviet Union. Of course, just as in the case of the United States, China too is disappointed because that dream hasn't worked out as well. The West has no intention of making space for the rise of China or any other power in the future. And they are determined to push back. So what you see is a systematic global pushback against China. And in addition to that global pushback, particularly in terms of trade defense measures, but also in terms of technology denial and in terms of political pushback, you have a series of other developments in China which is also leading to some kind of a rethink. First and foremost, it's not going to grow at 10% per annum again. It slowed down to less than 5%, and you can never trust Chinese statistics. But even at 5%, I just want to put it in perspective. It still adds quantitatively more GDP per year than India adds at 8%. So we need to put that in perspective. But nevertheless, it slowed down to 4%. And that has an impact on people's minds because when you've told people that you're going to have double digit growth for year after year for 30 years, when you tell them that's 4% growth, they don't think of 4% growth on $19 trillion. They believe that the economy is slowing down. So there's a mental impact that a slowing economy has not only on the ground, but in people's psychology. Added to that is the demographic problem. And that's a very serious problem. China's population is in sharp decline because of the one child policy. Now, it's not so much a problem of manufacturing, because China is going to substitute people with robots. But robots can't consume. That's the problem. And an economy like China's, if it is not going to export, needs to have domestic consumption. And 800 million or 900 million, which is what China's population will be by 2075, is not going to consume as much as 1.5 billion. And in addition to that, the problem is domestic consumption is falling just at a time when China wants domestic consumption to grow because of pushback from trade defense measures of the Western countries and even countries like us or Brazil or Nigeria. And that's essentially because the only savings the Chinese had was in property. Bank rates at their peak were 3 or 4% per annum, which in India is what the interest rate is at its lowest, right? It's at the moment 8% or 7.8%, and has been so for a decade. China's has never risen above 4%. And at the moment, it's close to 2%. Gold was never a major source of investment for them. And therefore, the share market is relatively new compared to ours and has gone through a very bad time from 2016. So, property was the only investment, and property prices have crashed. And they're not going to go up because China is overbuilt. It has just built too much property and there's not enough demand. So, what you have is a negative wealth effect in the minds of people. They all seem to think that just when I'm coming to my retirement years, my savings have halved. We have only one child. That one child has to now support four parents because they're living longer. We don't have the money, so we'd better save and not spend. Just when Xi Jinping says spend, 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 because we have to support the economy. So China is also facing headwinds. And lastly, China is a highly conflicted power. It's a power which has to engage with the rest of the world because it's still an export driven economy, and it can topple the United States from its perch as number one only if its economy grows fast. But on the other hand, domestically, you have a situation where it doesn't want anything to do with the world because it feels that the rest of the world is out to topple the Communist Party of China. So what you have is a very odd paradox where a country, in a sense, it's like imperial China. You want to be the world's supplier of goods, but you want to stop the barbarians at the gate. You don't want the barbarians to come in. And so, how do you replicate a model like Britain or the United States, which at the peak of their power allowed you to come in because they were confident that they could be better than you in everything? Because that's what a world power is. That's what India was for 10 centuries before the 15th century. We allowed free trade into India entirely because we had exported more than we imported. China is not willing to do that. So you have a country which is building a fortress. And if you look at what they're doing, Belt and Road, an alternative to the WTO. WeChat and Alipay, an alternative to GPay. Sina Weipo, an alternative to Google. Union Pay, an alternative to international credit card systems. DeepSeek, an alternative to ChatGPT. SpaceSail, an alternative to Starlink. So in everything, they're building an alternative, insulating themselves into an island, which they believe is enough because they have 1/8 of the world's population. So they think they will survive. And so, just to sum up, what you have is a very odd situation. That one, you have a country which is a major power is a leader who believes that the world is not giving anything back to the United States, so let's pull the whole system apart. On the other side, you have a country which has benefited from that system, wants the system to continue, but is not sure whether to invest blood and treasure in maintaining that system, because the Americans, all said and done, have spent both blood and treasure in keeping all of us safe, and I mean all of us safe. So that's really why the world is in this highly uncertain state today. I just yeah, okay. Just a few more remarks. I want to address one particular issue because before I come to where we stand in this world, I think there's one thing we need to get clear, because what we're hearing a lot about is this so-called multipolar world order, and everybody speaks about it. And it's a good idea, so long as we're all clear as Indians that at the moment it's just an idea. And let me just illustrate with the facts. Let's talk of the global economy. Let's take World Bank figures, and I'm taking World Bank 2022 figures, right? The United States, roughly $25 trillion, China, roughly $19 trillion GDP. The next five economies in the world, added together, Germany, Japan, India, France, and Britain, added together, has a GDP less than China. Military spending, another very good factor of global power, and I'm taking Stockholm International Peace Research Institute statistics. That's generally regarded as the gold standard for defense spending, the Stockholm Institute. United States, $1 trillion spent every year on defense. China claims it spends $350, but we know it probably spends closer to half a trillion because a lot of the programs don't figure and it's a very opaque and intransparent system. The next 5 countries added together, Saudi Arabia, India, Russia, Germany, and Britain, spend less than China. I pose to you, what world order, what multipolar order are we talking about? We have 2 countries whose economies, whose militaries, whose diplomacy is vastly, vastly greater than anybody else. It's a multilateral world. I mean, I hate to say this because Thiru is the expert on multilateralism. It's a multilateral world simply because these 2 countries can't by themselves decide what is to be done on climate change, for instance, or on nuclear non-proliferation. If we don't cooperate, if the Brazilians don't cooperate, if the Nigerians don't cooperate, you really won't have a global system. So it's a multilateral order, but it's a multilateral order, not a multipolar one, a multilateral order with very strong bipolar features, and the bipolarity is growing day by day. Now, for us, that's going to have a major impact across a whole set of fronts. On trade, every time the Americans and the Chinese slap tariffs on each other, our supply chains get affected. So the costs of manufacturing, the cost of industry, the cost of supplies goes up. Every time one denies technology to another, you're moving into a world where ultimately you can not only not pick and choose between the 2 technologies, but at some point of time, the United States is going to say, if you have Chinese parts in any particular machine, I'm not giving you technology. And I suspect China is going to very soon say the same. So the freedom we had in a post Cold War order where we could pick and choose technology is also rapidly going, because the Americans and the Chinese are building what is called small yards and high fences. They are fencing off very small niche technologies, but building such a high fence that nobody else can get in or out. And therefore, essentially, the technology is held with them for much longer than the digital world would normally allow people to hold technology. A currency war is in the offing, because if there's one thing the Chinese leadership is absolutely determined to do in the next 10 years, it is to break dollar hegemony. The dollar is king, and until they break dollar hegemony, they cannot break the United States and become the major power. So they're hell bent in this regard. That has implications for us as well. Fourthly, in all the major new sector areas, there's a fierce competition. Outer space, underwater, cyber, quantum, artificial intelligence, and there are no rules. All our rules are the 20th century rules: nuclear non-proliferation, missile technology control regime, World Trade Organization, WIPO. No rules in any of these technologies, and there's going to be a bitter fight between the 2 of them, and the implications are going to come on us because we are hopefully rising in each of these areas. And lastly, Taiwan, which I won't address, but I'm happy to talk about in a question, which if there is a crisis in the Taiwan Straits, I think the Indian economy will be severely hit. So you really have a world where we need to start rethinking where we stand. And I just want to end my comments with a few comments on our side. I know it's very easy to be pessimistic about all this, but I think we have to be optimistic. We have to be optimistic simply because we should not miss the wood for the trees, the forest for the trees. The fact of the matter is, we are all looking at the last 20, 30, 40 years, but we should be looking at the last millennium, because we are in the midst of a millennial shift at the moment. Till the 15th century, India was the center of the world. The Indian Ocean was the center of the world. And naturally, we were the richest country in the world. And by then, the second largest economy, because China had overtaken us somewhere in 12 or 1300 of the Common Era, but we were by far the richest country in the world. Uh, 3 events happened between 1490 and 1520 which changed that. Columbus discovered the Americas, 1492. Vasco da Gama discovered the route to India, 1498. Ferdinand Magellan's ship circumnavigated the globe in 1520. And the result was a fundamental global shift. Everything moved from the Indian Ocean to the North Atlantic. Now, power, of course, is fluid. It flows where the money is. So it moved from Spain and Portugal, Dutch to France to the British and to the Americans, but it remained firmly on that Atlantic axis. That is shifting. I think the trend is irreversible. Whether or not we grow as a major power, the trend of the entire economic axis shifting to the Indo-Pacific is inevitable, simply because China, ASEAN, and others are also growing, and we are slap bang in the middle of that. So I can't. If this is not an opportunity, I don't know where the opportunity is. We have to be realistic in understanding where we stand in this opportunity. We've got a great geopolitical location. We have a sustainable population. We have political stability. And I'd be happy to explain that, but I don't want to spend time. But I would really be happy to explain that later if anybody's interested in knowing why I think political stability is important. We have human capital, and we are the only country between Israel and Japan which can independently exercise both economic and military power. ASEAN can't exercise military power. Its economy is our size. Japan has constraints on military power. Its economy is our size. The Gulf may have lots of money, but they don't have military capability. So these are strengths. But there are severe weaknesses in our system. $4 trillion is no big deal, however much we may tom-tom it. Our social indicators are poor, particularly on social equality, on gender, on health, on housing, and so on. It's still very poor. Our technology is really fallen behind. And I was telling one of the young people a conversation that I had with in Boston in November last year with a Nobel laureate who's in physics, 2005 Nobel Prize, who told me that in his laboratory until the year 2000, 75% of all researchers were from India. There are none now. And he says you can't find them because Indians are not interested in basic research anymore. They're only interested in applied sciences, management, and such things. And he said you can see it across American universities. Very few Indians in basic fundamental research in the sciences. We are very, very far behind there. We have absolutely no clue how far China has gone ahead. The United States is scared. That tells you something. So we have to recognize that we have very limited capability. We are not a global power by any means. We are not even a regional power. We are a sub-regional power which can exercise influence from the Red Sea up to the Malacca Strait, and that's about it. But that's where the future lies, because it just happens that the Indo-Pacific is now the center of economic activity. And very fortunately, thanks to the last three governments in office, that sea blindness has gone. We finally realized that India's wealth in the 15th century is before the colonial powers came not from the Indo-Gangetic plain, because that's the granary of India. It actually came from India's coastline. So the coastal states, the southern and western states, really are right in the center of that opportunity. And we have to seize that opportunity, and we have to build on that opportunity. And therefore, we have to do a few things as a country. And that is essentially grow the economy, but actually really invest in technology. If we don't invest in technology, frankly, there'll be very little difference between the 19th century and the 21st century. Where we bought textiles from Manchester and Leeds, we'll now just be buying our mobile phones or digital devices from Washington and Beijing, if we don't really develop alternatives there. We have got to build a more sustainable foreign and national security policy, one that after 75 years doesn't depend on buying bullets and guns, leave alone major platforms from foreign countries. We've got to realize that as a people, we have to sacrifice to invest. We are the only major power which cannot make a semiconductor, and that is really frighteningly shocking when the world is just all about semiconductors. And we really need 10 years, and we've got only 10 years. The demographic dividend, in my opinion, is gone. It's almost vanished. We have just 10 years, if we're lucky, 5 years we have to make that shift. If not, I think we are permanently going to be a great market, of course, and China and the United States are going to compete, and you can leverage your market, but you're never going to be a great power. So I think we have a lot of thinking to do, and we have to see how the world evolves and try and see where the opportunity lies. I think I'll stop there, Thiru, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
No, thank you, Vijay. Thank you for this absolutely fascinating introduction which you have given. In fact, I thought uh, the so-called beginning of the breakdown of the world order really started when China joined the WTO, a non-market economy, joining an organization which was promoting free market. So I thought that was really the beginning of the end, so to say. It has taken us 20 years to reach there. But it is also a fact that, and you said quite rightly that it is not really President Trump who is pushing he's accelerating it, but he's not the one who started the breakdown of the world order. But President Trump has been quite open in what he wants to do, even from the first term. His rapprochement with Russia. These are all things he talked about in the first term. And he talked about and told Europe that it's about time you took care of your own security architecture. And he told them, start devoting more of your GDP to defense. And he was also very clear where he was with respect to the UN and other things. And even with China, he wanted a deal with China, and he talked about it, and he got some minor deal, which I think was hardly a deal. But once again, I think he's talking about a deal with China. And even China, apart from this 125, 200, 300% tariffs, which he was, but China has been reacting in a very sober way. They have not overreacted, and their reaction has been proportionate to the reaction of the Trump administration. That's the way I look at it. And so it was, I think, a clear signaling on the part of China that fine, we'll be reacting proportionately to what you do, but we are still open to a discussion. I suppose that's what they signaled. And it is very clear now that they have got, I think, a 90-day period. And so this deal with China, uh, how do you think it'll impact? Because there are a lot of other things. I'll come to the other questions later, but it will have a big impact when China and the United States come to a deal. It will have an impact on Europe. It will have an impact on Indo-Pacific, certainly, and certainly on India. So I just wanted to get a sense from you. How do you see this so-called deal with China going? Which will bring me later to the question that will this deal include Taiwan? But I'll come to that.
Yeah, but I think the problem with the US China relationship is they're in an embrace they can't get away from, because their economies are so interlinked that trying to pull the economies apart, the manufacturing economy, will severely damage both. So while the United States threatens to stop imports from China, it cannot, simply because its own industry will
Correct.
collapse. When China threatens to say we will reduce our treasury bill holdings in the United States, they can theoretically do that, and automatically the value of their currency and the world's currencies will fall. So they will hurt themselves as badly as the United States. So they have no option but to go ahead and make the deal. And both China and the United States are very pragmatic deal makers. And we have seen in the past, even the Soviet Union, which was ideologically much less keen to make deals with the United States, did it when it suited their interests. The nuclear non-proliferation deals, the NPT and the CTBT are one good example, where they were willing to constrain their own friends like India in order to reach a deal with the United States. So firstly, I think we should never rule out the possibility of a deal and the implications that deal may have on us. And we certainly need to work on the worst case scenario that they will do a deal with the Americans. But beyond that, I think there's a structural problem in that relationship between the United States and China. And that is not looking back at manufacturing, but looking ahead in technology. I think the United States has realized that they've created a true competitor. The Soviet Union was never a true competitor. It was militarily powerful but economically weak. Here you have a country which is not only economically and military equal, but technologically probably an equal, and possibly in some technologies ahead of the Americans. So the US sees it as a challenge to its hegemonic position. And therefore, the competition between the two is not going to come on trade, it's going to come on technology. And on the one hand, you may have a trade deal, but I think the concern that might somehow disadvantage other countries politically or geopolitically, I think is unlikely to happen. The United States is in a serious competition with China now. The entire state in Washington is geared to dealing with China. And in the case of China, now they openly say the US is the major threat. And therefore, we have to find space in that geopolitical competition between them to take advantage. While, of course, addressing the fallout that might happen on any deal with trade that happens. So it's a sort of mixed picture, and we can't have it's not a black and white picture for us.
But you mentioned that, and quite rightly, that Trump has been extremely transactional and in fact, sometimes I think it is better to be an adversary of United States rather than a friend at this point of time, because adversaries are being treated better. But the thing is, many of what he is doing also has geopolitical implications, and it has gone beyond transactional. Whether the reset of relations with China, or the reset of relations with Russia, for example, or even with Europe, and in fact, the threat to uh, the global order interestingly, for the first time ever, the so called liberal global order, which we are all used to, for the first time comes from a country within the global order, which is the United States. That's why it's so serious. Earlier, it was coming from without. And now, the pillar of the global order, which is the United States, is threatening it. So, going forward, um, you know, as they start resetting this, and I'm happy you clarified that probably on a geopolitical level, it may not have that much of an impact. It'll be more because there are structural issues. But if they have an understanding with China, there will certainly be a fallout on India. So, what sort of a fallout do you see on India? Because if they are going to, let's say that you have your sphere of influence and we have our sphere of influence, if the US and which means Taiwan technically will there has to be understanding on Taiwan. And what if will there be an understanding and what will it be on Taiwan if it's going to happen? And if there is going to be spheres of influence between the two countries, then where will we fall under the sphere of influence? Because it will definitely constrain us as a country which is now trying to reach out and do better and better. So I just wanted to get a sense from you.
Yeah, Thiru, I think we have to be careful to believe that there could be a deal over Taiwan. I mean, there could be a deal over anything theoretically, and the Americans are very good deal makers, and so are the Chinese. But Taiwan is not about territory. It's an existential problem for both. It's an existential problem for China because it is very difficult to explain to their own people and for their own dignity and image that 100 years, which is going to come by 2049, after the new government has been established, China is the world's leading or second largest economy. How can an island 100 nautical miles from the coast of China be independent or be not under Chinese control? I mean, it hurts the dignity. And I think as Indians, we can understand, right? Because we have the same view of Pakistan occupied Kashmir. It's, in a sense, the dignity of India which is involved. And in China, that state lays much greater emphasis on dignity than we do. Their self-image as the Middle Kingdom, as the central power, is much greater than ours as a civilization. Ours is more of a cultural civilization. They're a highly political civilization. So for them, it's an existential thing. For America, it is existential not because of that tiny island and the semiconductors on it. It's existential because they've projected themselves as the leader of the free world, as the defender of democracy. And if they allow democracy to be snuffed out by force, nobody from Japan to India will ever trust the Americans again. Because if the Americans are not going to come to the defense of democracy, then frankly, they're not going to come to the defense of any of us either. So for the Americans, the day that Taiwan is taken and they don't do something, that's the end of American global power. I mean, it will just vanish like sea foam. And that's why both of them have to play this game of ambiguity, strategic ambiguity. I don't know what I'm going to do, but you must presume I'm doing the worst. Both sides do that. And therefore, Taiwan becomes a very critical issue. I will come to spheres of influence, but since I'm talking of Taiwan, I wanted to explain. Therefore, a crisis in the Taiwan Strait is something which is both real and very scary for us. Now, I just want to be very clear. A crisis in the Taiwan Strait is not war in the Taiwan Strait. Because a war in the Taiwan Strait is a world war. It's not going to be confined to a tiny water passage between mainland China and Taiwan. If those two countries go to war, it is a world war that will occur. I'm talking of crisis as anything short of war. In other words, an action that China does where the United States cannot convince its Congress to put boots on the ground. That could be missiles fired into the Taiwan Straits, a blockade of Taiwan, an air quarantine over Taiwan, so you just don't allow anything to fly over it, land in it, etc. A massive cyber attack in Taiwan which paralyzes electricity, financial grids, brings about the virtual collapse of internal stability and social stability. Any of these scenarios eventually leading to the Chinese being able to take the island without the Americans getting an excuse to put boots on the ground. In that situation of crisis, too, the implication for India is going to be huge because even though the United States will not put boots on the ground, what the US will have to do is do a massive, massive global sanctions, which will literally cut China off from developed markets. And China simply cannot afford that situation because all its revenue comes from developed markets, not from countries like India or Brazil or what we call the global south. So, what is the implication if there's a crisis in the Taiwan Strait short of war? all shipping gets affected, which means any Indian industry which is exporting east of India will have a knock-on effect, whether you're an exporter or an importer, right? But even west of India, if you export or import, you're going to have a problem because all supply chains, 30% of supply chains are from China. So if the West's manufacturing is affected, or the domestic consumption gets affected because purchasing power is affected, and even if you're not exporting to Japan or Korea, but only to Europe, your exports are going to get hit. But that's just the first order effect. The second order effect is all supply chains will get affected because if the Taiwan Strait gets blocked, it's not only China, it's Taiwan, Japan, and Korea. So your supply chains will get severely disrupted. Thirdly, your semiconductors are concentrated in this area. We already saw during COVID what the impact is of semiconductors not coming. And we have to realize where a services driven economy, everything from e-logistics and e-commerce to ordering a pizza will be affected eventually, depending on how long the war lasts or how destructive the Chinese are on the island of Taiwan and what retaliation the Americans do if they do anything. And lastly, submarine cables, 15 of them going from Asia to Silicon Valley are anchored off Taiwan. And China has just shown its capability of cutting submarine cables. They now have the capacity to cut the cables at its deepest point, which means your IT and IT-enabled services industries goes for a 6. So I think we are going to have a huge economic impact of a crisis. And I want to be clear, in the Taiwan Straits, if it's war, of course, I mean, I shudder to think what will happen to the Indian economy. But and I think we are completely unprepared as a country. We have done no exercise to understand what the implication is. If somebody asks the implication, we think in terms of the typical things, commerce ministry will do what, finance ministry will do what, but that's not the issue. The issue is education ministry. What is it going to do? Your computers won't come. Your digital economy will collapse. How do you do teaching? It's going to have an impact on entertainment industry, on education industry, on other key things which we don't think it will have an impact on because we still think in terms of dollars and cents, which is trade, investment, and technology, and nothing beyond that. So if we are not prepared, then I'm afraid we're going to have a very difficult time. And we can guess away at when the Chinese will do it. I'm absolutely sure it will be done before 2049. If I was a Chinese leader, it would be fundamentally unacceptable to me to go into the 100th anniversary of my republic being founded with this island 100 kilometers away, which is not under my control. It can happen anytime between tomorrow morning and 2049. It will happen between tomorrow morning and 2049. If we are not prepared, we are going to be in very serious trouble. But so far as the spheres of influence are concerned, I think the deal cannot involve spheres of influence because America is too deeply integrated into the Western Pacific.
Yeah.
It can't abandon Japan, it can't abandon Korea, it can't abandon the Philippines or Singapore or Thailand because if it does, there is no American power in the Pacific. Once they do that, all of us will just simply make peace with the new hegemon, and that includes us.
Correct.
And that's the end of America. So I think there won't be spheres of influence, but what we have to be prepared for is a compromise to our interests in the Indian Ocean. Once the Chinese establish a permanent naval presence by the end of this decade. By the end of this decade, we will have a permanent Chinese carrier fleet in the Indian Ocean, which means you have two powers now, the United States and China. And they may compromise here because the vital interests of both are involved, but it's not an existential problem for either. And that's what we have to care for, not spheres of influence. I think we are too big to be simply kept out of influence in the region.
In fact, Ambassador Vijay Gokhale has written a wonderful paper on the impact which any Chinese action on Taiwan will have. It has been published by Carnegie India. And if you have time, I would encourage you to go and read it on the net. I think now that we are looking at a reset, so to say, now one of the things is about Europe. Now the transatlantic alliance between the United States and Europe, now that seems to be going into the ICU. I don't know, how to put it, but something fairly serious is happening there. And President Trump has said that, and he's told them before, and they didn't care very much for what he said. But now he seems to be very serious about it, that the security architecture should be different for Europe. It will not involve the Americans mollycoddling them. It will not involve the NATO, once again, trying to put things together. Now, if that happens, and he also talked about start investing more in defense. So if that happens, then let's say 2% of Germany or something goes into defense. That is really the 2 or 3% from the GDP which the French and the Germans and others were putting in the welfare state. And therefore, the welfare state of which they were trying to, that takes a big hit in Europe. So, and also the whole question of European security probably should include Russia. And of course, I'll come to that later, because Russia has this interesting principle of indivisible security, which indivisible security actually means that you cannot have security at my cost. So Europe seems to be in a bit of trouble. Ukraine war is going on right in the middle of all this transition. So on the one hand, they want to prosecute the war. On the other hand, US says don't do it. So how do you see this very uneasy type of transition which is taking place, and where do you see this heading?
Yeah, oh, that's an interesting question. I have a slightly different perspective. Of course, they have their problems between them. It's like in any family, there are family quarrels. And rightly, I think if I was in Washington, I think the Europeans have taken the United States for granted for far too long. And the Americans are now pushing back. And that will lead to more defense spending and so on, and a certain amount of readjustment of the relationship as such. But I think the Western alliance is still fundamentally strong because they have a common challenge, and that challenge is not just China; it's India as well as other rising emerging economies. And I think we saw an example of it during the India-Pakistan crisis, right? When it came to protecting a vital asset in Pakistan, the entire Western world just didn't come to our support. I mean, I'm not in the government, so I can say it. The fact is, none of them came. None of your friends stood with you.
Yeah.
By the way, all of Pakistan's friends actually came and stood out with them. Turkey, China, Malaysia, and Azerbaijan, four of them came and stood. Not a single Quad partner stood with us. So I think we must be very clear that that alliance has a certain foundational strength which will remain when it is outside the Western world. Within the Western world, they're going to quarrel, and the United States is going to tell Europe, you have to take greater responsibility. I think where the crisis will come is China. The European thinking is that in a situation where the United States is unpredictable in terms of markets and technology, can I afford to also alienate the world's second largest market?
Yeah.
And unlike the United States, which is in an existential competition with China, the Europeans are not. They have no illusion that either individually or as the European Union, they're going to replace China as the world's greatest power. And therefore, the tendency to compromise with China is going to concern the Americans, but also, of course, have an impact on us, because if the Chinese are able to convince the Europeans enough that for both of them to sink or swim, they need to do business with each other so that America's malevolent influence becomes a little less. The cost is going to be borne by us as well. After all, if they take market share, who loses market share? Big exporting economies like us. And that really should be our focus. What are the Europeans thinking of China? What is the United States thinking of China? And where would we be, and what should we be doing in Europe? I have to say, I have always been a strong advocate of free trade agreements with ASEAN and Europe. I see the government has taken a 180-degree turn from saying we don't want to do it to doing it, but it hasn't been done yet. I think if we don't do it fast enough, and of course we have to protect national interest, and that includes economic interests and commercial interests, but if we don't do it fast enough, the Europeans are going to do more business with China, and eventually that's going to impact on us. So I'd say if there's any concern we have about the Europeans, and the Americans have about the Europeans, it's not their fight over who's going to spend more, it's about China.
Yeah, in fact, you have been a great votary of free trade agreements. And the other thing is, they always say that energy comes from Russia for the Europeans, security comes from the United States, and market comes from China. So I think if you have an energy disruption or a security disruption, it is, I think, inevitable that the market expands with China. I think that's so. Which brings me to Russia. I mean, because we all know how the Europeans. I think some way the Europeans have taken this Ukraine war to a very large extent, and there has been a lot of sanctions and others on Russia. But at the same time, the United States has done a completely 180-degree turn on Russia, and they want to reset their relations with Russia. And this essentially involves the fact that even within the United States, acceptability to have a rapprochement with Russia may be very less. So he's in a way, Trump is going against the grain of what his own constituency probably is thinking, which is very brave of him actually to do that. And in fact, I'm convinced that if he had had this rapprochement with Russia in the first term, there would be no Ukraine war. Anyway, that's a different thing. But so therefore, it cannot be that he tries to shake Russia off their alliance with China because they have what is called the no limits partnership with China. It seems unlikely just for the next 3 years, Russia will give up such an important partnership. But certainly, he has something in mind when he wants to reach out to Russia and try to fit in into a security architecture. And I think he probably believes it belongs to part of Europe as well. So, how is this relationship with Russia? He's not made much headway, thanks probably to various. But can you give me a sense of how this is progressing with Russia?
Yeah, so I think those who are skeptical of Trump's efforts to sort of build a new relationship with Russia call this a reverse Kissinger. I mean,
Yeah.
Kissinger, in fact, got the Chinese away from the Russians into the American
Yeah.
camp, and Trump probably thinks he can get the Russians away from the Chinese into the American camp. Whether that happens or not is something which nobody can predict. But I think Trump is not far fetched in pursuing that course of action. And I'll tell it, in my mind, an alliance has many definitions, right? The Anglo-American alliance is at one end. Everything matches: political interest, economy, culture, religion, ethics, morals. The whole works. There's a complete symbiosis between the British and the Americans, and therefore that alliance is at one end. And at the other end is an alliance purely of convenience, where you are doing sort of you're friends with somebody simply because it serves your immediate interest. And I think the China-Russia relationship lies towards that direction, because apart from a common geopolitical interest, which is keeping the Americans at bay, America is a threat to both, almost nothing else matches. The economy it's a complete mismatch. China is 18 trillion, Russia at 1.8 trillion. In terms of culture, the Russians are European, the Chinese are Asian, the Chinese are atheistic or Buddhist, whatever you like to call them. The Russians are Russian Orthodox. Historically, the Russians and the Chinese claim the same territories. The Chinese actually say that all of the Russian Far East was the Chinese Empire before the Tsars gradually swallowed it all up. So I think this is purely an alliance of convenience. They are standing back to back with spears in their hand, saying that if the Americans come from this side, I'll do something. If the Americans come from your side, you do something. But so long as the Americans are a common threat, that alliance will hold. And that's really where we should be watching out, because at the end of the day, the only country which has actually come to our support through difficult times is Russia. It's not the United States. It's not even France. They've stood through thick and thin right from 1949 till now. Even in Galwan, where the statements were neutral, who gave us the armaments to enable us to stand up to the Chinese? Not the United States, I assure you. It was Russia. So when it comes to core interest, and the S-400, which is, I have no information, but from today's paper I read the S-400 was deployed. The S-400 they've given us is of a superior technology to what they've given the Chinese. The Chinese also have the S-400. And therefore, we need to rethink our relationship with Russia. Regrettably, over the past 15 or 20 years, for a variety of reasons, that relationship has been allowed to degrade politically, militarily, and economically. And much of it is intentional. And we are now touching the point where the Russians might well say that the Chinese are India is a fickle ally. China is a more reliable one. When that happens, the tipping point will come.
Yeah.
And at that tipping point, we will lose the one reliable supplier that has supported us in times of need for our defense, until such time as we can make an S-400, which is 10, 15, 20 years down the road. So I think we really need to look at the China-Russia alliance, not from how it impacts the United States, but how it's going to impact us. And I think that I get a sense that the government has figured this out, because from the statements now emanating from our leaders, it's very clear that the language they use is very different from what they've been using in the past with Russia. I hope we can claw back the relationship. It's never going to be the relationship of the past, but at least if we can keep the thought in our mind that Russia is vital for our national security, we might be able to salvage that relationship. And if we salvage that relationship, it automatically puts a brake on China because we are on both sides of that country. And at the end of it all, as Palmerston said, there's no permanent interest and there are no permanent enemies or allies, there are only perpetual interests. And I think Russia's perpetual interest doesn't perpetually bind it to China. It's being forced there because the West is being so unreasonable in compromising and putting sanctions on the economy. I'm not saying they're being unreasonable on Ukraine. I think that's a different story. But they are putting sanctions and they've been troubling Russia for the last 20 years. And therefore, there's no option but to go to China. And when that pressure eases off, I think you will see cracks in that alliance. So we have to just manage the system, the relationship for the next 10 to 12 years and ensure that it doesn't turn adversarial for us.
No, in fact, that sort of brings me to the other trouble spot, which is Israel and Gaza war and others. It's just interesting that the first trip which President Trump, took was actually to the Gulf, and he has gone and met all the three leaders, and he's obviously had an extremely successful trip. But apart from that, it is also a fact that even in his first term, he was really looking at once again a normalization of relations between Israel and through the Abraham Accords. And to a very large extent, he actually succeeded. And he also, I think, even the Gulf countries were very keen to make sure that this normalization took place. So, and Saudi Arabia was literally going to be the last, and we were told that it is literally 15 days away or whatever, and I don't know how far that is true. But the point is that it was stopped thanks to the attack of Hamas. Now, is this number one? Is he trying to shore up support in the Gulf for an American type of what he may have in mind, and or is it a part of his Abraham Accords which he's looking at with the rapprochement with Israel? And just as Ukraine has complicated his rapprochement with Russia, I think Gaza war has complicated the Abraham Accords, so to say. So I think if you look at it, what do you think is the motivation now of the United States in that region, where they are very clearly and strongly supportive of Israel? But this is complicated by number one about the Gaza and the Gaza war, but also about the deal which he's planning to do with Iran, and that's another thing where that will be a very different type of dynamics altogether if that deal comes through. So how do you see this going as far as the American point of view is concerned?
So I think the motive for both the United States and for the Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Qatar in particular, is economic. There's no political motivation here. I think the United States probably thinks that if it can restore peace and order to the Gulf, that the vast amount of wealth that the Emirates, the Saudis, and others have will eventually get invested in the United States and lead to the revival of their economy. And you saw what Trump did in Qatar and in UAE. He was busy supposedly announcing $1 trillion deals. That was the bulk. He never went there to discuss Israel, Palestine, or Saudi Arabia, Iran. He went there to raise money. So I think there's a strong economic motivation, and in his mind, it's an entirely rational exercise because there's a huge amount of cash they are sitting on, which they are looking and wondering where to invest. And the United States has not exactly been the most trustworthy for them. From the Saudi, Qatari, and Emirates side, it's also economics. They realize that oil will get phased out, if not in 20 years, in 40 years. And they have to make the transition to a non-oil economy. And they really can't do that if Israel and Iran and Turkey and Qatar are playing politics with the rest of the Gulf. And the root, the sort of the basic foundation for peace has to be the United States, because it's the only major power which is willing to put its money where its mouth is. So for them also, a settlement of the Gaza problem or even the Saudi-Iran problem will eventually result in them being able to develop their own economies, the non-oil economies. So I think there's a convergence of interest there. As far as Iran is concerned, that's a much more difficult thing because Iran is a regional power, and it is fundamentally opposed to Sunni Islam. It's a Shia power, and therefore there's a competition between Saudis and the Emiratis on one side and Iran on the other. And of course, then you have Israel, which is dead opposed to doing anything with Iran. So that's going to be a much more difficult exercise. But you see how the Americans have been able to convince the Saudis and the Emiratis that it is in their interest that Iran is brought into the fold with adequate guarantees to ensure that they don't go nuclear or threaten their neighbors with nuclear weapons. And I think the Saudis and Emiratis are perhaps backing that initiative. Israel is the problem in the whole thing. I don't know how that will pan out. I've actually not looked at that issue. And that's probably worth looking at. But I think Trump essentially is trying to resolve many of the wars or the conflictual situations because it wants to reduce its own footprint financially and militarily so that it can save more money to invest within the country. I think it's the right approach, but whether he is actually doing it sensibly or not is another matter. I mean, to go and shake hands with a Syrian leader who still figures on the FBI's most wanted list at number one is undermining your own institutions and ultimately a country's institutions, what is now pejoratively referred to as the deep state and is there in every state, ultimately is who the only ones who can deliver your goals. So if you frustrate your own deep state, I mean, it's hardly likely they're going to support you. So we have to see where this goes.
Yeah. So I think I would like to now throw the thing open for questions from the floor. And I'm sure Ambassador would be very happy to.
Ramesh from the Business Line newspaper is probably the most basic question you ever faced. Now, what is it that China wants from us? We are not a threat to them. If it is just a question of acknowledging their supremacy, well, there is no point even asking, but they're way too ahead of us, as you just pointed out. I'm completely flummoxed. What is it that they want? Why are they needling us all the time?
I agree with you. There's no fundamental conflict of interest. I think it's easier said than done when you say that we should acknowledge their supremacy. That's what they want. Right? They are. See, we have to look at China's history. China had a very unusual history from anywhere else in the world. It was at one end of the Silk Road. It essentially was a supplier of goods, but nobody went out of China or into China. The middlemen were Javanese, Indians, Arabs. These were the middlemen carrying that trade. They were a world unto themselves. So, unlike almost every country in the world which had constant enemies and therefore needed diplomacy, dealt with them as equals, as subordinates, as peers, as superiors, China had no enemy as such. Okay, there were invasions by the Huns and those sort of things, but it wasn't a constant enemy. When the Mongols came, then they became the rulers. When the Manchus came, they became the rulers. But so it is used to being a singular state with no enemies, but only vassals and tributaries surrounding it, right? So that's the image of that China has today. If the states around it, and India is one of the states, accepts that status, not physically, but mentally, they won't have a problem. The question is, are you willing to do that? You are a civil. No, I don't think so, because we are a civilizational state which also have a sense of ourselves. We've never been a political state because our boundaries have never been defined until the British came. But civilizationally, we are one state for thousands of years. And that sense that we are a great civilization imbues in all of us. We immediately feel prickly when somebody, when Trump says Indians and Pakistan has been fighting with Kashmir. Our first instinct is, what do you mean? There was no Pakistan before 1947. And that's a civilizational reaction that comes out. I don't think it's very easy for India to do that. But that's not the problem. Okay, that can be finessed. The real problem is this is an existential fight between China and the United States. And their strategic doctrine after 2011 has fundamentally changed. Their strategic doctrine is, if we have to fight the United States, it's not going to be on Chinese soil. It will be in the periphery or proximate regions. And we are squarely in that proximate region. Which side do we stand on? And if you look at their writings, they are consistently convinced since 1950 that you stand on the side of the Americans. Despite your having bad relations with the United States, they believe when push comes to shove, your DNA, your British influence, your constitutional democracy, your human rights, your whole civilizational identity is Western, because you are a part of that Eurasian culture. One went in the direction of Rome, the other came in the direction of Varanasi, and therefore they are not convinced that when push comes to shove, you will stand with them. If you are able to convince them, I don't think any other problem will stand in the way. And we have to think of a way in which we have to build that new relationship with China. The old one was destroyed with Galwan. It's never going to come back. But we are at the stage where we don't have an old one, we don't have a new one. And it can't continue with a country 5 times our size and immensely powerful. So that's really a dilemma. That in my mind is the fundamental dilemma. There are small problems here and there, Arunachal Pradesh, Kashmir, those are problems, but they are not fundamental dilemmas.
Yeah, hi. My name is Gopal Ratnam. I've spent the last 25 years actually working as a journalist based in Washington, and I'm actually.
I presume this is all off the record?
Yeah. No, I'm not reporting this, but I'm just.
Please don't quote me.
It was actually very interesting to see that both of you actually seem to have a way more trust in Trump's long-term strategic thinking and planning than I think most people in Washington would give him credit for. Because it seems to everyone who lives and works in Washington that what he is really after is a series of deals, no matter what the underlying issues are, somehow paper over them, get a deal and somehow get himself nominated to a Nobel Peace Prize or something so he can then, go off to Florida. But to go back to Ambassador Gokhale's point, I mean, if you accept the premise that Trump is only a representation of the demands of American people to ask, okay, what has the world done for us? And if you then combine that with the remarks that Trump has made, for example, in the Middle East recently, he has told the Middle East Gulf monarchies that lectures on human rights and democracies won't be coming from the United States. Why should we believe that impulse to promote democracy or push for human rights would somehow materialize in the context of Taiwan?
No, it's not a question of, it is already a democracy with liberal human rights. The question is if it gets extinguished, America's reputation suffers, because the reputation is based on it being, quote unquote, the leader of the free world. And that's a phrase which has transferred from the Soviet Union, its competition with the Soviet Union, to its competition with China. China being an authoritarian state, which does not give its people the right to freedom of speech, expression, and thought. And so there's a certain thing called reputation beyond hard power. Once that reputation disappears, America's allies disappear. Alliances are not simply made on money and arms, they're also made on trust. And that trust at the moment is the United States will come to the defense of democracies. If the test fails in Taiwan, which Japanese, which Korean, which Filipino, which Vietnamese, or which Indian is really going to then even remotely trust the United States? That's what I was saying. I'm not saying that that Trump is not going to wave the flag of democracy and human rights. In any case, I believe that Trump is not a transitionary figure in American politics because he's got re-elected after a 4-year hiatus, only the second American president to do that, which means he sustained a popularity over a 12-year period, which is a long time to sustain popularity in fickle democracies where you change minds about your leaders every few days. And therefore, I think that even if he moves on after 2028, Trumpism in some form or the other will continue for a long time in the US. So we can't just assume that when Trump goes, things will change again.
And also considering that some of his policies in the first term was actually taken forward by President Biden.
On China?
Yep, in China particularly.
So my name is Sunil Ralan. I run and operate the Chennai Free Trade Zone, a concept which I learned when I set up my company in Dalian, in the Dalian Free Trade Zone around the SARS period. So as you rightly pointed out, in the 90s, the Indian GDP and the Chinese GDP was sort of at par. Now the whole world today, which is almost having 30% of the manufacturing, is coming out of China into the global supply chain, which is valued at 25 trillion, and almost 4 trillion comes out of China. Now, the whole world has been saying that Chinese government, Chinese state has been subsidizing industry, subsidizing manufacturing, and therefore they've been able to cannibalize market share in the global markets. We in India, we see Indian companies going into the government, whether it's the the current PLI scheme or other schemes, and there's always, paucity of funds, there's no budgets available, and all sorts of things. Now, I fail to understand how two economies which are fairly similar 30 years ago or 35 years ago, China could find the resources and sustain it for 30 years to take over markets in every economy in the world, whereas we in India have not been able to do that while we are of the same size and scale and probably resources as well. So, is it something the way we understand Western economics in India and the way China has devised their economic model? Is there some difference in that? I mean, I don't understand why is it that we are not able to do what China has been able to do.
Yeah, that's a very good question, and the answer is mindset. What Deng Xiaoping did between 1980 and 1990 was fundamentally change the mindset of the Chinese people by telling them that developing the economy, some people getting richer than others, acquiring wealth, acquiring the material comforts was not against socialism and had to be done so that a higher level of a better quality of life could be attained. And very clearly telling the bureaucracy that it had to make the shift and that it was in its own interest to make the shift, because when you made the shift, you got better pay, you got better conditions, and so on and so forth. I think that we very often tend to think that everything is a function of money or of material things. But India, we not only failed to make that mental shift, we haven't made that mental shift even till today. So what you saw in China, and it was particularly interesting because I was there between 97 and 2000, which was the time when China really took off. And you could see the contrast. If a foreign businessman came to Shanghai, the governor was there to receive her or him, take them to the area of investment, hold their hand, and complete it. In our case, there would be nobody at the airport to receive them. If they wanted to see the chief minister of state, there was no problem arranging that meeting. In our case, there was no question of the chief minister meeting an individual foreign investor. In their case, the prime minister in the 90s, I'm talking of, not today, would actually invite top 50 or 100 businessmen every year for a 2-day conference and ask them what their problems were. Now, whether he did anything or not, and he did do something, but that was not the issue. They were getting heard. In our case, even today, we don't do that. And on the difficult issues, human rights, I mean, they were knocking the Chinese on the head just like us. The Chinese took it on the chin and then pocketed their money. In our case, the moment human rights is raised, we bristle as if everything is fine in India. It becomes a matter, that's the civilizational state in us. I mean, we are so civilized that there's obviously no human rights violation in the country. We bristle at this. And the result is we put off others. So, it's an attitude issue. It's a mindset issue that has led to many of these problems. And that mindset is still not sorted out in the government, even till today. Until that is sorted out, and I was having a discussion, maybe we were having a discussion on the National Science Fund, and with the Chancellor of Korea also, that at the end of it all, you may set up a 60,000 crore fund. But if a committee of secretaries is going to decide, and the committee of secretaries have no clue what quantum communications or quantum sensors are, you're not going to see the money. It's just going to remain in the budget. Whereas in the case of China, let me give you a small example. They went out into the United States in the 90s, identified 12 or 15 top Chinese Americans in everything from nano to quantum to semiconductors, and said, you come to China. We will set up state-of-the-art lab for you. We will buy whatever equipment you want. You bring your 10 people and come here. You set it up and go. You keep your American citizenship, but you train our people. And today, if China is at the frontiers of science, it is because of these labs. What will happen in our case, and I'm being very frank, we will say, oh, that Indian American will come. How can he be paid more than the Secretary to the Government of India? So we will pay him only 2.25 lakh rupees. That man is earning 2.25 lakh dollars per month. Why would he come? Nationalistic patriotism is not so great that you start cutting your throat in order to, come back. So we have, and that's a mindset issue. I have been part of this government and therefore I'm guilty of this. But it is a serious mindset issue in the government, even today. And that's the real difference between China and India. If that changes, I think it's a long race and we'll catch up.
Good evening, sir. My name is Trijal. I'm from Shishya OMR School. I'm studying in 12th grade. I just have one question, sir. So, regarding the Malacca Strait and the South China Sea being such crucial points for China, where half of their oil trade is passing through these points, what would happen in a scenario where if India blocks the Malacca Strait and the Seattle members block off major straits and ports in the South China Sea? What will happen to the Chinese market, and how much can they rely on the BRICS members and the Belt Road Initiative?
Yeah, so the Malacca Strait is an absolute choke point for China. And in 2004, the president of China described it as the Malacca dilemma, and it's become the core of Chinese naval policy after that. Under no condition will they allow the Malacca Strait to be closed, which is why they are going to station a carrier force in the Indian Ocean, and they're having a naval base at Djibouti and possibly a second one in Gwadar. So for them, the Malacca Strait, there is no way they will allow it to be closed. But as an alternative, there is this idea floating around that all of you may have heard called the Isthmus of Kra. It is the narrowest point where where Burma and Thailand merge into the Malay Peninsula. At its narrowest, it is less than 60 kilometers. So technically, you can build a Panama Canal or a Suez Canal from the Gulf of Thailand straight into the Andaman Sea, and you bypass the entire Malacca Strait and all the problems with Indonesia, the Lombok, the Sunda, the Makassar. Those are the only three exits, in addition to the Malacca Strait, where any ship can come out of the Pacific into the Indian Ocean. Right? If these are blocked, they want to open the Isthmus of Kra, and they're working very actively with the Thais to do that. And this is of direct concern to us, because the first bit of land which it confronts when the Isthmus of Kra is opened is the Andaman and Nicobar Islands. That is the frontier. That's a huge strategic asset for us, because we are then the front line there to block the Malacca, to block the Isthmus of Kra. But we shouldn't be looking at it in purely security terms. There's a massive economic advantage if we correctly deal with any port on the Isthmus of Kra, because at the end of it all, it cuts shipping costs very substantially. It cuts insurance costs very substantially, because you don't go. It saves about 1,500 kilometers of a ship going through the Malacca Strait and up into the South China Sea. It just cuts across. And that means from our eastern seaboard, that includes Tamil Nadu, the cost of exports, the cost of shipping, the cost of imports will substantially come down if the Kra Canal is built. We have to therefore think there's a strategic downside and there's an economic upside, and how do we balance it? And the way is to invest in that port. I mean, if you know it's inevitable, you might as well also put investment and tell the government of Thailand, please don't give everything to China. We are a strategic investor also. That is one implication that has to be thought through. But the Chinese are absolutely determined not to allow the Malacca Strait to be closed. So it's a challenge for us and an opportunity. We control the Malacca Strait at one end. And that's a very interesting question you asked, because it's one of the key questions bothering the Chinese.
I am Ramchandran, Chartered Accountant. I am talking about the development of science and technology in India. In 2020 budget, the government of India sanctioned 8,000 crores for the National Quantum Mission on National Quantum Mission on this one. And this one, my wife, Dr. Hema Ramchandran, was the one who spearheaded that project. And the DPR was approved in October 2020. And then it took 2.5, 3 years for the cabinet committee headed by the Prime Minister to approve the DPR. And even today, understand, what has been spent on it is only traveling and conveyance.
I rest my case in that case.
I wanted to tell that because you spoke about this one,
But let me also be frank. The problem is not at the political level. It is at the bureaucratic level in our country. The political leadership is a very enlightened leadership and has been for the last 20, 30 years, at least since 1990, when we did our reform.
I understand.
So it has to be that mindset change has to come in the bureaucracy, not at the political level.
I understand, Dr. Saraswat, who was heading this National Mission on Quantum Technology, directly communicated with Mr. Modi and got the approval. And then, my and other 3 scientists were appointed for the completion of this project. But unfortunately, after it was approved by the Minister of Science,
No, no, I think we shouldn't get into personalities. I think let's leave it this thing. No, no, it's not fair to get into, because I think, as he says, he's talking about a mindset. So we take it on board.
Good evening. I'm Priya Krishnan. I wanted to ask you, how much credence would you give to the argument that the political system in China versus the chaotic democracy that we are works towards their advantage? I mean, you have an sort of an autocracy, a communist government, so he can do whatever he likes and he can get people on board, versus us and having to take everybody on board. Is that a valid theory? And what you were mentioning about the outreach that China is able to do to attract talent. So how does that work? I mean, do they go out and diplomatically exercise influence to get more talent in, get economic investment in? How does that work?
Well, thank you for that question, because I've been thinking of this particular question for a very long time. What is political stability? Of course, authoritarian governments or autocratic governments, and that is including in democracies, are able to implement things better. But if it was simply a function of autocracy, then North Korea should also have become China. And so should a lot of African dictatorships and Asian dictatorships, but they're not China. So it can't just be authoritarian governance, which is the economic growth cannot just be a function of authoritarian governance. It has to be policy. And it is policy that has driven China. So we have to be clear that while authoritarian governance helps in implementation and in removal of obstacles, the policy formulation has nothing to do with authoritarian or democratic governments. But on the larger question of political stability, I think we have to differentiate between political stability and governmental stability. They are two very different things. So the general impression is India is a very unstable country. Every time a politician comes and goes, you have frequent elections, state governments keep changing. China is a very stable country because it's got one government. But that's governmental stability. But in terms of political stability, we have had 14 general elections. We have had 18 transfers of power. In not one case has that transfer of power been questioned by anybody else. And in the one event that you actually put democracy in abeyance, it is not foreign intervention or civil war, it is the democratic process. Through the ballot, we threw Indira Gandhi out. I mean, which other country can have that kind of political stability? In the case of China, if it's such a wonderfully stable place, why doesn't Mr. Xi Jinping put himself up for election? Anyway, he thinks he's going to get 99.9% of the vote. If he's that confident that the people love him, he should do that. On a more serious note, the world is so used to assuming that confusing between political and governmental stability that they presume this regime will last forever. But history has shown us authoritarian governments do not last beyond a point. This authoritarian regime has lasted longer than many. It's actually overtaken the Soviet Union last year, right? But it is not going to last endlessly. What happens when there is a political collapse? Because there's no system. In India, there's the constitution, there are the courts, the media, the legislature, political parties. We're used to dealing with hundreds of people with hundreds of different opinions. The Chinese are used to none of this. And I think there will be a catastrophic implosion of the system, not of China, but of the system. And it will lead to worldwide problems, because a political collapse in 1990 made no difference, Tiananmen incident. Something that's happening now at a $20 trillion economy will have an impact globally. So we have to be clear about it. China is politically not a stable entity. It is governmentally very stable. But nobody knows politically what's going to happen. And to take a bet that it will continue for the next 100 years like this, in my opinion, I would never take that bet. I think at some point or another, a tipping point will come when that change has to come, because authoritarianism does not survive any great length of time. A democracy survives because people come and go. So we are fundamentally stable, and that will the end of it all. Your question is, it may be slower, a policy may be slower in getting there, but the consensus that we build up in the country makes it virtually impossible to do a reversal of policy. Whereas in the case of China, policy decisions are quick, but you don't know when the system collapses what will happen to that policy. That having been said, as I said, policy is very fine, but if your machinery to implement it or your mindset is not enlightened, then I mean a democracy will be hampered, and we have to deal with that.
I think we'll take two more questions. Two more questions.
Good evening. Seeing the dying state of the transatlantic alliance between US and Europe, and NATO being at its weakest state it's ever been since its birth, Is there any outside possibility of something like the Warsaw Pact coming back, like having Russia in the middle with the Balkan states and Turkey and Azerbaijan, whatnot, to combat the outright eastward expansion of NATO? Wouldn't this help Russia and a lot of its neighboring countries as well?
That's a good question, but I don't think the Warsaw Pact is going to come back, because those who were under the Russian boot, as it were, until 1990, Poland, the Baltic states, the Balkan states, are not interested in going back under Russian boot. What is interesting is what a new system, a new arrangement that the Chinese and the Russians are building in Eurasia called the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So it's gradually expanded beyond the 6 Central Asian states, China and Russia, now to India, Nepal, Pakistan, Iran, now Turkey and the Emirates. Basically, the view is that if the entire Eurasian landmass is united under one group of common countries, then the West can't do anything to any of them. So that is what they're building now. It's not a Balkan, it's not a Warsaw Pact, because Warsaw Pact was a military pact, and so far, India is never going to agree to that, and I don't think Turkey is a NATO ally, Emirates is an American ally, but that's what the Russians and the Chinese are trying to do: build a larger group of countries which will, in a sense, stand up to the West. And we have to see where this goes, because it cannot be dismissed lightly. It's a very serious effort by them. And to what extent even we can stave it off, if it is in our interest to stave it off, is questionable. But that's a very, very good question and needs to be studied much, much more closely.
Good evening. I'm Sunita Reddy from CIC. Thank you for setting the context so thoughtfully. My question is really, when you spoke about Indian civilization, what role does religion have to play in this? Because you spoke about the countries that came to Pakistan in their defense and none really coming to stand by India except Russia. My second question was that India will continue to need investment. If Europe is not really looking at India as an investment destination, and neither is USA currently, is there a hope that we can build this whole concept of working with the rest of Asia, the Middle East in particular?
Absolutely. Let me take the second question first. I think one of the great and undeniable successes of foreign policy that this government has had, it is to build that relationship with the Gulf states and with ASEAN. In the case of ASEAN, we moved from look east to act east, and a number of the relationship has grown in terms of investment, technology, markets, and so on. But the real success was with the Gulf states, which until 2014 were essentially looked in India as places from which remittance was coming, because Indian citizens were working there and sending back money. Beyond that, we had no relationship at all. Today, it's a strategic relationship, it's an economic relationship, it's a security relationship, and of course, it's a financial relationship. And I think the objective is to get a lot of the Gulf money into India as a form of investment, not just in the oil and gas industries, but even in terms like food security, water security, and so on, in terms of food chains and other supply chains being secure for their people, because they're out of the sense that they are over invested in America, they're over invested in China, and they're looking for another destination which is reliable. In other words, they can get their money out quickly. If so, I think certainly that appears to be the basis of policy, and I think that's why the special push has been made by the current government to all those countries. And I think to some extent it is also working. It's another matter that whenever that some big investments like Saudi Aramco wanted to build this huge refinery in Ratnagiri in Maharashtra. Government of Maharashtra still hasn't been able to come to a decision. $22 billion refinery. So, mindset issue again. But there is a keenness. On the first one, I think that, when I said India is a civilizational state, I think we're defined more by culture than by religion historically. In the sense that whereas, in fact, there were independent kingdoms for almost all this time, and they grew in size, reduced in size. But I think there was a cultural connect in many ways. I mean, it was religion was one of the parts of that culture, but also tradition, and various other factors, lifestyles, beliefs, ethics, morals, and so on. And I think that defines us. So what I'm saying is that, I don't think that Pakistan's friends sided with Pakistan because they were Islamic. China is not an Islamic state. Malaysia is a fairly moderate one. So, and even Turkey, of course, Erdogan is taking it in that direction, but there are still secular elements there. I think in our case, they did not come to our support because essentially we are too big for them to put their eggs in our basket fully. They're a little concerned at the end of it all that if we allow ourselves to prevail over Pakistan, they will lose a key strategic asset through which they control the Indian Ocean. And therefore, they always play the double game with us. They'll support you on terrorism or counterterrorism, but they won't support you when you go to do this lesson. I think it was a sobering lesson for all of us when we believed that our relations with the United States had improved, we had now got into Quad, that the dynamics had changed. The bottom line is that we are on our own, and I think the External Affairs Minister yesterday said this, that at the end of it, we are on our own. We have to get used to being on our own. Pakistan will always have a few friends. I think we have a lot of well-wishers, but I don't think any of our well-wishers really wants us to get too big for our boots.
On that note, I think strategic ambiguity is a new term which I learned today. Thank you, ambassadors. It's been a jugalbandi where Ambassador Tirumurthy has played a very, low-key role today, but we know how much of a Jambavan he is. Thank you very much, and I think I must share this with you. Ambassador has been very, very self-effacing about the bureaucracy, but when he was in Taiwan, many of the investments which have flown into Tamil Nadu are solely because of him. When we took delegations, it was he who would ring us up and put pressure on us that why isn't Tamil Nadu coming with a delegation? And when we went there, he would brief us that this is the companies you're going to meet, this is Foxconn, this is Honhai, Honhai is Foxconn, and Asus or whatever. Brief us on that and then debrief us after we finish the interview with the companies, then follow up and see that the investments came through. So, self-effacing, yes, but I must acknowledge that many of the investments which came in were due to the dynamic support of Mr. Gokhale when he was in Taiwan. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I'm sorry that many more questions couldn't be accommodated. It's already been an hour and a half of continuous brilliant exposition where we got a glimpse of the entire situation across the world. It was not just China, it was not just America, but I think Ambassador Tirumurthy took us or nudged the Ambassador Gokhale to talk to us on various issues. And our young friends, I'm really happy to see that, youngsters are coming asking fantastic questions. I think they deserve a good big hand for that. And I must also apologize that we have not been able to accommodate everyone. We have very eminent people sitting, on chairs over here. I'm sorry. And that is exactly why we need our own center. So let me make my pitch for that too. And I'm glad to inform that our center is coming up very fast. And maybe in a year, we'll be ready to accommodate maybe double this size in our own premises. Thank you very much for attending today. And just a few announcements of our next events. On June 7th, we have Manifesting Auroville, the City of Dawn. On June 14th, we have India's military options and ramifications in aftermath of Pahalgam. Major General Indrabalan will be participating in that. On 21st June, we have the Co-Intelligence Revolution by Krishnan Narayanan. And on June 28th, The Truth on Your Plate by Chris Ashok, who is the author of Masala Lab. So we have our whole month of June lined up, and we'll be happy to accommodate any further interesting personalities whom we could bring to our stage here. So please continue to support Chennai International Centre, and we promise to bring you brilliant expositions like this. A big hand for our two ambassadors. Thank you.